Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unlocking the secrets of a 400-year-old mystery, the kind that still completely captivates audiences and scholars alike. We are, of course, talking about William Shakespeare's absolute most iconic tragedy, the story of the Prince of Denmark. But hey, we aren't just going to recount the plot. Nope, we're going to deconstruct the very DNA of this masterpiece. From the wildly unstable physical texts that have somehow survived the centuries, to the clinical psychology of its characters, and finally to its living, breathing history on the stage. But right before we jump in, I really want to anchor us with this absolutely staggering number, 28,628. That is the exact word count of the second quarto edition of the play. To put that into perspective for a second, that makes it by far Shakespeare's longest play. Literally, if you tried to stage this text completely uncut, you're looking at well over 4 hours to perform. It's a colossal, sprawling piece of art. And as you're going to see, that sheer length has historically been both a massive blessing and a huge challenge.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We'll be looking at the mystery of the text, the origins of the prince, the method in the madness, Ophelia's tragic reality, and finally, 4 centuries on stage. So, part 1, the mystery of the text, a literary cold case. Let's get right into it. We usually think of classic literature as being, set in stone. Just a single, definitive book you can pull right off a shelf. But treating this play like a literary cold case reveals a remarkably unstable history. There's actually no single, definitive, authentic version of the play. None. It was printed in 3 wildly different versions during the first quarter of the 17th century. First up, we've got the 1603 First Quarto, or Q1. Scholars usually call this the bad quarto. It's barely half the length of the others. The character names are completely different, like Polonius is called Corambus, for instance, and the poetry is just full of errors. It's widely believed to be a memorial reconstruction. Basically, it might have been pirated by an actor who played a minor role, maybe Marcellus, just trying to remember the script from a touring production. Then, just a year or two later, we get the second quarto, or Q2. This one's the good quarto. It was explicitly marketed as being newly imprinted and enlarged to almost as much again, giving us that massive 28,000 word count we just talked about. Finally, in 1623, the first folio, or F1, drops. Now, this version adds 85 new lines, but it completely omits 200 lines found in Q2, and it changes hundreds of individual words. So when you sit down to read the play today, you're almost certainly reading a modern editor's blended compromise of these wildly conflicting texts. Crazy, right? And this brilliantly illustrates just how drastic those textual differences can actually be. On the one hand, we have the immortal line from the second quarto and the folio, to be or not to be, that is the question. I mean, it's poetic, it's philosophical, it's pretty much perfect. But contrast that with the first quarto version. To be or not to be, there's the point. To die, to sleep, is that all? All. No, to sleep, to dream, marry. There it goes. Wow, it feels incredibly clunky. Honestly, it's almost like someone trying to recount a brilliant speech they overheard at a party the night before. It just completely lacks those subtle, alternating shifts in mood that define the character's internal struggle. Moving on to part 2, Origins of the Prince, Tracing the Legend. So where exactly did Shakespeare get the idea for this brooding, avenging prince? He definitely didn't just invent the plot from scratch. The deep, legendary European roots show a really fascinating evolution. The core motif of the hero is fool, someone faking stupidity just to survive a murderous regime, well, that dates way back to ancient times. We see it in the Roman legend of Brutus and the Scandinavian saga of Hrolfr. By the 13th century, this morphs into Saxo Grammaticus's Life of Hamlet. This version features a prince feigning madness to avenge his father, a super hasty marriage by the mother to the usurping uncle, and the hero actually killing a hidden spy. Then, in 1570, this story was translated into French by Bellefour, who introduced a totally crucial element, the hero's deep melancholy. Shortly after that, there was a lost play performed in London. Scholars today call it the Hamlet. It might have been written by Thomas Kyd, and it famously featured a ghost. Finally, between 1599 and 1601, Shakespeare absorbs all these influences. He takes a pretty traditional revenge plot and completely elevates it with just unprecedented philosophical and psychological depth. Which brings us to part 3, Method in the Madness, the psychological profile. So, we are going to treat the prince's mind kind of like a clinical psychological evaluation to answer the most famous question in literally all of literature. Is he actually mad? This is the question that drives the entire plot forward. To an Elizabethan audience, madness had very recognizable outward signs, right? Disheveled clothing, speaking in babbled nonsense, and really erratic, sometimes violent behavior.
The absolute genius of Shakespeare's protagonist is the fascinating tension between his performative insanity and his genuine, very real trauma.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because we can actually break his mental state down into two distinct categories. On one side, you have his feigned antic disposition. After he encounters the ghost, he explicitly tells his friends, "Hey, I'm gonna act mad in public." This fake madness gives him the freedom of a court jester. He can speak uncomfortable truths in riddles, he can insult the king and Polonius directly to their faces, and he can completely mask his investigation into his father's murder. But we have to contrast that with his genuine melancholia, basically what we would call deep clinical depression today. In his private soliloquies, where he's speaking his unvarnished truth directly to us, the audience, he describes his dark, inky clothes, his total loss of mirth, and how the entire earth just seems to him like a sterile promontory. He's suffering from profound grief, isolation, and eventually highly disturbing hallucinations and violent outbursts. So it's this incredibly complex dynamic. He is pretending to be a madman while simultaneously suffering from a severe actual mental health crisis.
All right, part 4, Ophelia's tragic reality, a mind unraveling. This really forces us to shift our focus to another central figure in the court, Ophelia. Her experience with madness serves as a clinical and profoundly tragic contrast to the prince, because while the prince uses his disposition as a weapon, Ophelia's mind genuinely unravels. When she breaks down, after her father's murder and the prince's pretty cruel rejection, she completely stops speaking in the structured, measured verse of the royal court. Instead, she shifts entirely to singing in prose. These heartbreaking songs, which are often referencing death and the loss of her virginity, they signal to the audience a total, undeniable break from reality. So the crucial point here is this: Ophelia's madness completely lacks soliloquies. We never actually get to see the inner workings of her mind. While the prince is constantly turning to the audience to explain his intricate plots and his deep philosophical despair, Ophelia is entirely locked inside her own shattered psyche. Her inability to speak to us directly really emphasizes her total lack of agency. She's just caught in the crossfire of the men around her. Her descent into genuine insanity is the devastating collateral damage of the prince's calculated game.
Now for part 5, 4 centuries on stage, the living text. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is looking at how this incredibly complex, highly elastic character has survived and evolved over 4 centuries on the stage. It's just fascinating how wildly varied the interpretations of the protagonist have been. I mean, we often picture a slender, brooding youth in black tights, right? But the very first actor to play the role, Shakespeare's good friend Richard Burbage, was famously described in an elegy as a large, portly man. Actually, Queen Gertrude's line during the final duel, where she notes her son is fat and scant of breath, was likely written specifically to accommodate Burbage's actual physique. Then, moving to the 19th century, Edmund Kean revolutionized the role by abandoning regal finery entirely. He played the prince in plain, simple clothes, turning the whole performance into something deeply introspective and serious. And then there's the legendary French actress Sarah Bernhardt in 1899. This role actually has a super rich history of being played by women as a breeches role, and Bernhardt's interpretation was globally praised as being manly and resolute. It really highlighted a character of immense spiritual power who thinks before he acts. The text is just so rich that every era and every great actor can find a completely different human being hiding inside those lines.
Which brings us to the tragic finality of the play. As the prince dies in Horatio's arms, having finally achieved his revenge, but, at the cost of the entire Danish royal family, his final words are, "The rest is silence." It is such a stunning conclusion. The textual mysteries of the early quartos, the ancient legends of blood feuds, the labyrinth of clinical depression and feigned madness, and the countless, wildly different stage performances over 400 years, all of it eventually echoes into this one profound, silent tragedy. We've explored the evidence, we've broken down the history, and we've walked through the complex timeline of literature's absolute greatest cold case. But the real brilliance of this play is that it demands the audience to be active participants. So, what is he? Is he a hero, a villain, a clinical depressive, a brilliant actor, or just a tragic victim of circumstance? I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. How do you interpret the Prince of Denmark? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.